Welcome to our panel session. This is going to be a discussion around the challenges and frontiers of data science in Europe. So at PyData London several months ago, when we ran the first PyData outside of the US, we experimented with running a panel at the end of the day to begin to understand the data science, the space around it in London and in the UK. And so here we're expanding on that idea and looking at Europe in general, but really focused around Berlin, trying to see what the challenges are, what's working right now, what maybe is missing, and then try to see who is involved in the local community to help some of you meet each other so that we can begin to bind the community out here and grow a larger European data science Python community. And of course, build towards the next PyData series of conference events. On the subject of binding the community, Valentin, are we going to the pub after this?
Supposedly so, yes.
And where might we be going to the pub?
So the idea is to go to the Hofbräuhaus, which is around the corner from here. And James went there last night, so he knows where it is. And Ian went there, so he knows where it is.
Many times they wear lederhosen. It's about a 4-minute walk away, and you can buy litre beers which are larger than your head. And you have to get a photograph holding the beer up, showing that the beer is bigger than your head. There have been many of those photographs. So I'm going to introduce the panel very briefly and myself, then I'll let them introduce themselves. We'll have a few questions for you, just so we can set the scene. And then I've got some leading questions for my panelists. I expect you to dive in with leading questions as well. Preferably, give them a hard time. Question them in some hard way. Let's finish the end of the day on an upbeat note by beating up the panelists with hard questions. So my name is Ian. I'm one of the co-organisers of the PyData London conference, and I co-run the PyData London meetup now, which runs regularly. And I think Valentin will mention the PyData Berlin meetup, which is beginning to form out here. I'm a data scientist back in London. I've been consulting for over 10 years, almost exclusively using Python. I've just finished writing a book with O'Reilly on high-performance Python. Please buy it. It's going to be amazing, and it'll teach you loads about high-performance computing. And I do a lot of Python training around data science. So those are my areas of interest. If you want to chat about this later in the pub, please come and have a chat with me. Here on the panel, we have, who do we have? Valentin, so the local organizer of PyData Berlin meetup and one of the co-organizers of this conference. So on that note, let's say thank you to Valentin. And by extension, of course, to all of the organizers of PyData Berlin. He runs his own consultancy, engineering with Python. He's been a speaker at EuroPython, and he's a trainer for Python as well. And he's particularly interested in fast data compression, and that's what he's been talking on. We have Kim. So Kim comes from the UK, but isn't British. She's running the Data Science initiative. She's sponsoring the conference. She's got a stand outside, looking to turn PhD graduates into through a boot camp to be ready for work in industry. And she's interested in speaking to anyone who is either interested in turning their PhD skills into a more marketable state ready for industry, or anyone looking to hire PhDs as data scientists. We have Adam, who is a Texan living here in Berlin. He is the chief data scientist in Xanox and will be taking an opinionated stance, I hope, on the local data science scene. And James Powell, I was going to introduce him as our special correspondent from the USA, but due to Google's autocorrect, he's our special dissident from the USA. He co-runs the Python, New York Python user group. And I imagine many of you have been introduced to him during his talk earlier today. So I'll let you guys just briefly introduce yourselves, a couple of sentences to build on what I've just said. So over to you, Valentin.
So to begin with, I'd like to thank all of the people that are involved in organizing the PyData conference. So especially Leah Silen. Leah, are you in the room? Let's give her a big hand. So she's done a terrific job coordinating everything all the way from Austin, Texas, And then she flew in here on Wednesday morning, and she came straight to the EuroPython conference, and she's just been behind the scenes organizing things ever since then. Hi, Leah. And then we have a couple of volunteers. So Philip, who's staffing the video booth right now, and Bagmeet up here, who's also one of the organizers of the local PyData meetup, and Svetlana. Are you in the audience somewhere? Okay, so Svetlana is there as well, and Esri. So let's give those people a hand too. And of course, James. So just briefly about myself. So I have a degree in neuroscience, but ever since I finished that, I've been doing a lot of data engineering work. I've always been interested in sort of how the tools work under the hood, how NumPy works under the hood, how you can achieve sort of very fast computation in Python, sort of how that works at the C level, how it works with memory allocation, how to avoid sort of temporary copies in memory, tools like numexp and so on. So those are really the things that I'm interested in. Alongside that, I also one of the core contributors of the BLOS compression library that Francesc Galted talked about this morning. So it's basically the two of us, more or less, that are sort of spearheading that effort.
Okay, hello. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. It looks like a great event. I've already talked to quite a number of you and quite a mix of people, very interesting. I come from a science background. I've done a PhD in astrophysics, and then I worked as a scientist for a number of years before trying to make a transition out of academia. I found that very difficult in the sense of knowing what can I do, what are my transferable skills, how do I apply for jobs, etc. Decided to do it by going through an academic route, so I did an MBA in the UK, and then thinking about these problems, I started two companies, PVGo Recruitment and PVGo Academy, which is all about trying to help PhDs make that transition, specifically into data science roles. And so we started the S2DS program in response to this, and we're taking 85 PhDs this year. We're starting in 1 week. It's really exciting. And then it's a 5-week program, first week lectures and exercises, then 4 weeks working with our partner companies on projects mentored by the partner companies. We've got 22 commercial partners, main one being KPMG, but also others like Hortonworks, Royal Mail, lots of startups. So very diverse program, both on the student side and on the company side. And just really excited to get started on that. So if you're interested in talking to me about that, I'll be here all of tomorrow as well. So stop by the booth then. Thanks.
So as Ian mentioned, I'm Adam from the US. I've been in Berlin for about 3 years, currently responsible for all of the data science and the software engineering functions at Xanox, which is one of the largest affiliate networks in the world. I think we're probably the largest in Europe right now. We have huge range of clients, about 5,000 advertisers work with us. And my background is actually in applied mathematics. So I've been in the tech industry, let's say, since the late 90s. Right now I'm working in online marketing and advertising. Before I worked in financial services, and before that oil and gas and a variety of other industries. So that's sort of the area at which I'm looking at the data science sphere.
Hi, I'm James Powell. It's nice to see so many people here today. I think this has been an awesome day so far. Just to introduce myself, I usually come to these events representing NYC Python. You may or may not know of NYC Python. It is the world's largest and most active Python meetup group. We have over 5,500 members. We have 4 events every week, and every other Thursday we have a gigantic event about this size at different startups in New York City. It's an amazing group. The amount of enthusiasm and energy in the US for Python is huge. During the day, I work in the finance industry. I'm the managing partner of a finance analytics company called the Python Quants, and we build infrastructure and analytics for hedge funds. We do a little bit of training, and we have a distributed Python Quants platform. And that's all about me.
And that's James.
I'm also from Texas. So high five on that. Yeah. It's the greatest country on earth.
Boo. So
If Texas weren't dragged down by the rest of the US and fielded its own soccer team, we would have beaten Germany 70-1. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, so I've got questions for the panel. I first want to set the scene so we can learn a bit more about you guys. Hands up, how many of you are actively working in data science? So on a monthly basis, you actively work in data science. So that's a good, clear majority, okay? How many of you work within academia in some shape or form, so professor, student, whatever? Okay. How many of you are researchers in industry? Okay. Okay. And how many of you are developers in industry? Okay, so that's kind of an interesting mix. So at EuroSciPy a couple of years ago, it was quite clear that the audience was majority academic, with some researchers in industry and very few developers. So here we seem to have a 1/3 split. So that's a nicer split for building a community and discussing ways to share ideas. How many of you are not in data science and are cross-training into this idea, and so using the conference for some research? Many of you? Some of you? Okay, and a bunch of you too. Cool. For those of you working in industry, how many of you work at a company that's got over 1,000 employees? Okay. And how many with over 100 employees? Okay. And how many in startups? Okay. That's very different to the EuroSciPy audience. And how many, say, freelancers or just a tiny kind of consulting company? That'd be me as well. Okay. James, do you want to contrast that to the PyQuant meetup you had in the States where you asked a similar question?
So I asked the same sort of questions at a conference that I ran in March of this year called For Python Quants. And we asked about the distribution, and we saw a mix between mostly people working in the industry using data analytics and finance, a small set of researchers, and then the rest were students. I'd say that the majority of people there worked in big bank finance at companies like GE Shaw or Bloomberg or JP Morgan or Bank of America. And I'm really impressed to see so many of you working in up-and-coming small startups. I think that's amazing.
So certainly there's a contrast for me here compared back to London, where the startup scene was definitely represented, but not to the degree that it seems to be represented here. And I have a view from London of the Berlin startup scene being interesting and growing, but I didn't expect so many hands to come up. So there's a definite emphasis difference between London and here, and I'm guessing from other places in the US.
Do you mind if I piggyback one question on that? How many people here use Python every single day? How many people use other languages like R or MATLAB? How many people you do Python as their main focus, nothing else, just Python? And how many people mix between the two, like 50% Python or maybe minority Python? Okay. And then one more question I was very curious about is how many people use Python as a kind of like a systems language, like gluing different pieces together? How many as just your pure data analytics, like you're in IPython notebook every single day and you're using that as a replacement for MATLAB or R? Okay. And does anybody build applications in Python, like full-fledged applications? Oh, wow. That's a really wild mix.
Yeah. Okay, little business question. How many of you are in charge of budgets? So how many of you are like developers, but how many of you are actually in charge of a budget? Okay, not so many of you. I need some more budget holders to fund the next event. Okay, we'll work on that one. Quick survey of tools being used. How many of you use pandas? Okay, that was easily going to be very popular. And NumPy, it's probably all of us. Scikit-learn. Okay, Python. What other famous tools should I be asking about? Scikit-image. Cool. Scikit-stats. Okay. Whoa. Any others to ask for the panel? Stat models? Stat models?
Oh, PyTables?
Okay.
Matplotlib, maybe?
Yeah,
Visualization?
Matplotlib, I'm sure that's
Oh, yeah.
many of us,
Some
whether we
people
like it or
actually
not.
like the way Matplotlib looks. Yay. What about ggplot? Oh, that's Seaborn? Bouquet? Does anyone use Vega, Vincent Vega? That's, oh wow. Got some cutting edge folks in the audience.
Okay, so thank you for sharing that. We've got a bit of an idea about you and how the community is different here from London, from the US. So we'll move on to some questions for the panel. So panelists, what sort of value can be uncovered when a company switches into using data science? So pick an example of when you've been with a company, they haven't been particularly using data science, and then they wish to extract value from their data. What kind of success story comes out of that?
So I think one of the problems that a lot of companies have, and this is something that I've seen when they come to talk to me, is they say, we have all this data, we don't know what to do with it, and we want to change our company strategy, we want to be more data focused and all this kind of stuff. There are a lot of different first steps that go into that. Usually it's some kind of data audit where I go in and look to see what they have and how it could be used and if the data is even valuable. And so I think you said, what's one of the first things that changes? And one of the first things that changes is the mentality of the people who are running the company about how valuable their data is. Because they start out by thinking that it's just the most fantastic thing ever, and their data is a special snowflake that's somehow more valuable than everyone else's data.
And they discover it's really dirty and horrible and inconsistent.
Sorry?
And they discover its inconsistencies and dirtiness.
Exactly. So I think the first thing to change, hopefully, is the perception about what the data is and how usable it is, and the quality of the data. And that's something that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of companies because they haven't been thinking about that before. They maybe were storing some data. They didn't realize that they weren't storing the most important parts, or they weren't storing it in a very usable way, or they weren't designing their systems in a way that allowed for building data products in the future. So the first thing that I see that changes, which is an unfortunate thing, to be honest, is an adjustment of expectations. And that should be what happens, because a lot of times the people who are making decisions about making a company more data focused, they're not so well versed in what that really means. So one of the first things that changes is the mentality that people have about their data.
So I work in the finance industry, and in the finance industry, kind of data science has a different meaning. I mean, it's difficult to divorce data and data analytics from the way that people trade in the finance industry. I mean, even very discretionary hedge funds will still kind of couch everything in some analysis of some signal. However, if you look at small funds, especially on the buy side, you can see that this technology is often extremely degenerate. There's an enormous amount of Excel. There is just uncontrollable complexity of this. The ability to do complex models is very, very limited. It's pretty miserable. And one thing that really, really excites me about Python is, I'll give you a scenario that happened to me only a couple months ago. I was sitting with a portfolio manager of a hedge fund. And he said, I have this signal and I want to change the way that we're doing this analysis of the signal. We're detrending it and we were doing a DFA and we want to do a centered moving average instead. And he sat down. This is a guy who had never programmed before in his life, not even a single line of VBA. He sat down with me and we were about to look at it, and he said, look, I already looked through the NumPy documentation and I pieced these two pieces together. I used a convolution function and I convolved it against a series of ones, and I think this is right. Is this correct? My goodness, this guy had never programmed before, and he was sitting in front of an IPython notebook with full confidence, writing code to do his analyses. And I've never seen people take to technology in that way. Excel is an enabler in this fashion, but just the availability of data analytics to non-programmers in the Python, NumPy, IPython notebook, SciPy, Pandas ecosystem is just absolutely amazing. Mm-hmm. Nobody else is as encouraged as I am?
So we have a mic over there that's live. You're very welcome to go up to it and either politely wait to ask a question or simply to heckle or just to shout out loud. So you're very welcome to join in this discussion. If you have a point you want to make about a company that you've worked with or seen who has had a good experience switching to data science, this will be a great place to share it. Certainly from my experience back in London, building on a point that Adam just made about the data quality, often an early discussion is about the data they've got and the end results they want to obtain. And then having discussed the wonderful data that they inevitably believe that they have, and then the results they want to obtain, it turns out they don't have enough data and it's in poor quality. Or perhaps, let's say they want to do a classification task, so they need positive and negative training samples. It turns out they've got all of the positive samples, they've got millions of them, but they've been deleting all the negative samples. And they just say, oh, it's great, we'll get some things off the internet and they'll become the negative baseline. And of course, that'll be a rubbish training set, and that would really mess up one's results. And so explaining the need for data quality becomes a big part of that. And so one of the conversations I try to have with clients is to get involved with them and explain early on. Start thinking about your data. Start thinking about what it is you want to achieve with it in 6 months or 12 months' time, and begin to adjust, getting your data set ready, so that when you come to exploit that data, it's in a ready state. You can bring in a data scientist and really begin to pull some value out of it. Did anyone else on the panel have something to add to that?
Well, I was thinking about your original question around what value company get when they switch from from sort of classic analytics to data science. And I was thinking through our 22 partner companies. And the thing is that we've got 15 startups with us, and all of them are pretty much based around data science. So they haven't switched as such. So can't talk about them. And then I thought about which ones are our established companies. We've got companies like KPMG, like Royal Mail, etc., that are just starting, really. So I couldn't actually think of an example of someone that has already switched. But what's interesting from our point of view is how these established companies try to switch, because we've got everything from the companies that say, okay, we'll hire one person and we'll see what they can do, and then we'll move on and maybe hire some more, to other examples like Royal Mail has really been impressive to us in that they've decided this year, to hire one really senior guy, give him a budget, give him the right to basically start his own department, hire 10 people this year. That's going to work across the whole of Royal Mail, which, to those of you who are British, understand that's a massive task. But they've actually given the guy the right to do that. So that's actually one of the challenges to companies, to big companies, is how do you get that started? But yeah, that was.
Konark. Oh.
What are the arguments you would say that are important to present to managers to make them decide this way?
So which arguments, panelists, are important to present to managers to begin to make them believe in the power of data science and the requirement to put a budget that way?
Well, it's tough. I mean, we can talk about our experiences in that if you want to hire one person, then first of all, you're going to have to hire the unicorn, the one that you can't find. And if you can find that person is extremely expensive. So it's going to be a large investment. That one person will probably quit after 3 months because they will be completely overwhelmed and not be able to shoulder that big responsibility of showing the value of data science. And we can talk about how you need a diverse set of skills that work together as a team. And then, of course, if you can go in and you can have a look at what data they have in a sort of consultancy way, say, here is some low-hanging fruit that you can quickly get done, quickly get some value out of. If you can prove that, and at the same time prove that you need to hire a team to do it, that tends to work. I mean, for business, you always have to show what is the return on investment. And if you can show that this low-hanging fruit will, within 6 months, give you 1% increase in sales or whatever, if you're a big company, that's a really big deal.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Adam. So basically...
Do you want to build a point on that, Valentin?
Yeah, but I can't remember what it was, so...
Sorry about that.
Konark, go on.
So basically, as Adam, you mentioned that it's difficult for established companies to form a data collection mechanism. So how I take it is as data as culture. until my developers start to understand why it is important to collect data, they would not write applications that will emit data in the correct format. Now, I work with a data platform team, and we are always preaching we should log unstructured data, we should have JSON as the format because it's flexible. But often we've seen that the applications start to abuse that because they would just generate a random set of keys and random set of values. For example, at times we've figured out that even keeping a date format intact in numerous number of applications become the challenge. And when you query for a particular date format, you don't have that data, right? So basically, how do we bring data as a culture in the developers? Talking about, say, we have a team of about, say, 100 to 200 developers. Now, telling them that data is very important because in this world of e-commerce websites, you want your websites to personalize basis users, you want better recommendations, and that is all basis data. Unless your applications start emitting data, you cannot build a layer on top of that. So how do I basically figure this out, and what's the trade-off between preaching data as a culture and having a good data science team at my company?
I'm sorry, you said what was the difference between data as culture?
Yeah, data as culture. I mean, how do we get this in the mindset of, so probably there's no SDLC involved that says data is part of the SDLC. You should write test cases around your data formats. You should write stuff around that and how it is being consumed by the applications itself. So, for example, there are manual pieces where you do analytics, where the data science comes into the team. And there are pieces where you have feedback loops wherein your data is automatically flowing back to the applications, and applications are transforming themselves based on the data that is flowing over there. So probably the point is, how do I bring data as part of the SDLC lifecycle that we have, in which developers then play a key role too?
So I think there's two things there. One is, how does one develop a good data collection culture? And the other one is, how do developers store the right kind of data so that it's ready for analysis? And I guess behind that is the question of, why would one analyze this data in the first place? So what kind of experience have you had around that?
So I think you can kind of break it down into if you're doing a new product or something that exists already. If it's something that already exists, good luck on changing it if it's in production and it's generating revenue. That's always tough. The question you had specifically about date formats or something like this and unstructured logging, one thing that I always try to advocate as a kind of cultural thing in a company is to make sure that any data you're pushing around has some kind of schema on it. Because as you said, you can use JSON, it's nice, it's human readable, it's convenient, but people will abuse it. And they do. So, for example, at Xanox, we use protocol buffers to push data around in our systems, and it helps a lot. That's a good first step. And in the beginning, you may have to do some explaining to engineers to say, well, why do I have to put a schema on this? I don't want to. The database has a schema. Why should I care? But there are reasons why you would want this for the data in transit, and so you'll have to sell it a little bit, because if you are starting out doing data science at a company that never had that before, they never thought about these problems. It wasn't part of their business requirement that the data needed to be somehow cared for. So you're gonna have to sell it a little bit. That's the basic answer. The associated question was, how do you participate in the development lifecycle? How do you do this? There are a couple of ways. One, you can have a data science team where the data scientists are integrated into development teams. That's one approach, and it works really well, especially for companies that are trying to make a cultural change. The other way is to have a team that serves as kind of internal consultants, which is slightly different. So instead of having a data scientist in an engineering team, they're available to an engineering team. And it should be the same also for the product teams. I think that's really important, especially in companies that have product departments. They're going to be focused on a slightly different set of metrics that are more business focused. What stuff should I measure about the product to demonstrate that it's valuable for the business? And in that case, it really pays to be involved at every step. So even before it goes to engineering, when the product teams are still thinking about it and they want to build it, it's really a good idea to sit with them and help them come up with how they plan to measure their product. And then once you have that picture, as it goes into the engineering teams, you can work with them because you have the background from the product side about the product. So there have been cases where I've started a discussion with a product owner or something, and they've had 50 or a ridiculously long list of things they want to measure about the product, and really they just need one. They just need one. And I think in terms of adding valuable things to the organization. Of course, schemas on data, important, but there's also the way you think about problems. And if you're a data-focused person, you're thinking about these data problems and how to collect it in a different way, you've reduced the complexity for the company a huge amount if you've taken 50 metrics down to one. So for anyone who was here this morning for JP's keynote, that's a big deal, and that pays off long term.
Thank you.
I'd just quickly like to add something. So in the past, I've spoken to a couple of people at companies, mostly engineers, and I found that they weren't really aware of what you can actually do with data. Sort of, they're aware of sort of this big data, which is, I mean, I think that's a bit of a hype, sort of this big data like buzzword. And people are like, yeah, big data this, big data that. And a lot of people equate big data with sort of NSA surveillance. And sort of in a way, I guess that's true, but there's actually like a whole load of like useful things that you can do with big data. And what springs to my mind is always this example of so Google has this thing where they can, basically what they did was they collected keywords of like, during flu outbreaks. And so they were able to, essentially using the search terms that were entered into Google, they were able to predict where sort of a flu outbreak was going to happen in the US. And this is sort of when I have this very sort of vivid memory. I explained this to sort of a senior level engineer, and he was like, oh, right. And he sort of had this like eye-opening moment where he was like sort of, you could sort of see like the cogs ticking in his head, where he was like, oh, right, so I can do this and this and this. And suddenly he was starting to generate ideas, what he could do with like his company's data. And it was just sort of, he wasn't actually aware that you can just take a whole load of data, and then just basically dump it into a huge correlation and then be able to predict things. So there's this book, it's called Big Data. I can't remember who the authors are, but that's sort of one of the books. It's like a popular scientific book. And I would recommend to sort of distribute this in the company and just get people sort of reading it so that they develop an awareness of like what data actually is, why data is valuable, and the kinds of things that you can do creatively with data.
So Bagmeet, one question, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Okay. So I have sort of, I want to share as an experience and then follow-up question on that. So in my limited experience working with industry on data science, usually companies who don't have a data science product in place or are not using their own data have something in production which is more like an expert system based on some heuristic rules or some market research. Not necessarily on the data they actually have accumulated, but from some other data on some other people have done some research, and that's what they have adopted as their expert system. Yeah. So this is generating revenue sometimes, and then they want to use their own data because they have now accumulated over time some data which they want to explore to see how whatever the heuristics they were applying before, how well are they actually mirrored in their own data. Yeah. So here comes the transition when you really want to change an existing system which is in production, and you want to use a machine learning based, for example, data science product, which is actually supplementing this or maybe in the long run replacing this expert system. What kind of, let's say, phase or what kind of life cycle do you think is most useful for a company who wants to transition from an expert-based system to a more data-driven, machine learning-based, or let's say data science product-based system?
Go on, Adam.
So I think there are sort of two ways this can go. And when you say expert system, you can have a rules-based system that's doing some kind of automated processing. That's one way. But a lot of times expert systems are actually some human somewhere that looks at a spreadsheet and makes some decision. And this, it may sound repetitive, but a lot of problems in data science aren't so much about the tools. I mean, I know we're at a technical conference that's focused on technical stuff, but a lot of it's very much culture stuff. Really is. And when it comes to replacing expert systems, if it's a person, that's a challenge because they have their own self-interests and things like this. If it's a technical system that's running somewhere, depending on what kind of architecture you have, you can implement whatever idea you have in parallel and measure the performance difference. And if it's a clear benefit, then from the business perspective, there's no reason not to use your system, assuming there's not some massive risk or something like this involved. So I think from the technical side, it's not super hard. If you have legacy software that runs and you just come up with something better, as long as you can show that it's just as stable and it's more effective, then it shouldn't be that much of a problem. If it's about a department that you have suddenly made unnecessary because you built a fancy recommender system, that's a much different thing to change. And I mean, it doesn't make sense to lose all that domain knowledge either. So you can't really say that, okay, now I built a machine, I don't need these people. It doesn't work that way. Those people still are extremely valuable. And you have to find ways for them to help the company in a different way than what they were doing before. So I think in terms of replacing, if you stick with replacing the tech, that's cool. Making massive cultural changes like now this department's not necessary, that's a very different thing.
Just a brief comment on that. So I was actually talking about a technical system, not a department, but that's a valid point, I agree. And I also believe that data-driven system needs that kind of, let's say, supervision, so that it is not sort of losing the expert, let's say, the expertise which you have actually gathered from the domain and all that. So the human element always is there, and it's very useful, I guess, as a supervisory system or something which keeps an eye on the automated system, yeah. So, but yeah, that was mostly.
But a lot of systems are not so automated. I mean, it was mentioned already in finance. I know, I spend a lot of time in finance. A lot of people are pushing around Excel spreadsheets. It is ubiquitous. And so in that case, you have an expert system that's, yeah, there's some technology there because people maybe have extremely fancy spreadsheets, but at the end of the day, it's still a person that's actually doing the work. So not all expert systems or not all systems are necessarily technical.
I mean, in finance, you can say that part of the system for the trading is captured in the gut feeling of the trader himself, right? So there's an expert system you can never replace. I remember many, many years ago, I was at Lehman Brothers looking at like a Black-Karasensky model amendments that they had made. And one of the things that we did in this analysis was we tried to match model outputs we tried to backtest it essentially. And there was one assumption that irrespective of how the model outputs looked, the traders were using this as one of the outputs to their gut feeling, and they had some internal, intangible, unrepresentable model of how the market worked that was driving them to make, or in the case of Lehman Brothers, not make money. And this is something that's very, very hard to replace. And I don't know that you necessarily want to replace it. You just want to perhaps control it, or improve upon it, or augment it in some way.
Yeah, in terms of systems that are part human, part machine, I've had this at a company before. Yeah, well, that would be kind of cool, but no. One thing that we did in order to prevent this, because if you have a group of people that are used to making decisions about something and suddenly you come up with this awesome machine that does a great job, they're going to fiddle with it. And that's kind of what you mentioned, is that they took the output as one factor in their ultimate decision. And one thing we did, and you said find ways to try to control it or influence it, is we had the machine running and it was possible to override it, but you had to go through a certain process to do that. Because in the beginning when we released it, we thought, okay, this is going to be great because it works great, so no one will touch it because it works so wonderfully. And that was maybe a little bit naive because it didn't work out that way. People started messing with it immediately. So we very soon had to come up with a way to let the system run, to let it work, to let it learn, but also have this kind of override system in place. So yeah, controlling that is a thing. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to step on to the next question. And this is something that Adam and Valentin will have an opinion on, hopefully some of you as well. So I'm curious about, out of the audience that we have attending PyData this weekend, which industries you would expect to be here, so Berliners in particular, which industries you would expect to be at a data science conference who aren't here. So I asked this because back in London, when we had the PyData London, we noticed that although there's a lot of pharma research in London and in the UK, there was one representative, and it was one of our organisers from pharma. So there was an interesting hole, and it turns out that the pharma industry doesn't use Python. They've got a lot of numbers, a lot of data, but they don't use Python. So there was an interesting bridge to try and build there into the pharma community, and that was what this co-organiser was attempting to do. And I don't think we had anyone from oil and gas in the community. People who are local out here, and so Adam and Valentin will start. Which industries do you think are missing here that maybe should be either brought into the community, or there's some strong reason why they're not in the Python? Okay,
so
absolutely.
Let's ask.
Yeah.
We should maybe ask if is there anyone from the pharmaceutical industry here?
But would you expect pharma to be in Berlin? I'm ignorant here.
Well, so I saw this map the other day of sort of large companies in Germany, and most of them are actually sort of based in Germany. It's called Baden-Württemberg, so it's in the south and in Munich, and sort of like all of the car manufacturers are sort of there as well. So I'm not really sure what I would expect. I mean, I guess we could ask. Oil and gas, anyone? Finance?
Do all of you work at the Deutsche Bank Risk Center?
Web-based companies? So, I mean, that's sort of what I would expect. I would expect a lot of people from web companies to be here, and that seems to be accurate. Is there anyone from sort of heavy industry, manufacturing?
Although we had Andreas with aerospace.
Is there anyone from the car industry, vehicle, car industry? What about alternative power? Okay. Like microchips, hardware? Consulting? Like operations, management?
Chap in the blue t-shirt.
I'm from automotive industry, not manufacturer, but a small company developing algorithms. And as far as I know, like me, I started with MATLAB because MathWorks is onto the universities, and they give an extremely low budget volume license to the universities, and if you are a professor there, and maybe into all developers, I've been in Python since 1 year. I'm a MATLAB guy and switched to Python now, and the first half year was the problem to install Python and to get it run on my Windows, because everybody's using Windows in a normal world, not here. I'm on Mac now too, but the starting point for everybody in programming is that you are used to use your Windows, and there you have a one-click install of MATLAB, everything is done, and you have MATLAB started, and then you can start to type, and if you are a student, you have all packages, everything is included, and you don't have to pay anything. You have the university has to pay, and then you go into the automotive industry, and there you have your colleagues, and everybody knows, maybe if you want to try it with MATLAB, if it's too big for Excel, try MATLAB. So, and then the story ends for Python. So if you guys get it done, and I think continuum analytics with Conda is the most important step. One-click install, everything's there. And if you get it into the universities, then maybe some year later, the guys in the development departments of the car companies are Python guys, and then somehow they get with budget back to conferences, and then your problems are solved.
Okay, and so on that point, how many people, when they use Python on a new machine, do a fresh install by downloading Python? Something I used to do, but I haven't done for a number of years. Does anyone make a native fresh install? You compile from source, of course, James compiles from source. How many people use the nthought distribution, so either the old EPD or the newer Canopy? Okay, just 1, 2, 3. Okay, how many people use Anaconda? That's probably going to be the bigger winner. Any other Python XY?
System packages, Linux system packages.
Any other main distributions that I've forgotten? Homebrew, okay, Homebrew on a Mac? Homebrew? Couple on, okay.
How many people only use a platform-based Python and don't ever install it? Use Heroku or something like that, which just provides everything for you?
No, okay. Okay, so for those of you who don't know the Anaconda distribution, it's worth noting that it is very MATLAB-like. It's not a clone of MATLAB, but it does come with all the packages. My MATLAB colleague was so relieved when he discovered the Spider IDE inside Anaconda because it looks just like the MATLAB environment. And then he was quickly up and running with an interactive viewer on the namespace and the like. So yeah, it's maybe worth exploring. There's a question?
Just curious how many guys here using Python 3?
Ah, good and potentially contentious question. So in a talk a few days ago at one of the PyPy talks, PyPy, the just-in-time compiler, Roman had the contentious 2.8 t-shirt on, which I personally quite disagree with. I've just made the switch to Python 3. So let's ask the question, how many of you are using Python 2.7 in your daily life? Okay, it's almost all of us. And how many have switched to only use Python 3? Okay, and how many use a mix of Python 2 and 3 at the moment? Okay, personally, I'll make the plug that I think in the world of science, it's about time that we made the shift because most of the libraries have been ported for over a year, and so we can probably trust that they are all bug-free, so that source of potential error has gone away. And by switching, it means we haven't got to support 2 major versions, just 1 major version, and the community gets to move forward faster. So I would gently urge you to consider the switch, certainly for new projects. Python 3 is a cleaner language than Python 2. Does the panel have any points to add to that?
I have an example where I have a talk where I use Python 1.5. But I'm the only person.
You think I'm going to give you the microphone so you can talk about Python 1.5? Come on, man. No way.
Yeah, no, don't give him the mic for Python 1.5.
It's completely agreeing with what Ian said. I mean, I have no stake in the matter, really. I haven't been in the Python community for like 10 years. So for me, it's one tool in a box with many other tools. And I'm often confused about the strong support for Python 2 in the community. I don't really know why it's that way. Ian and I were discussing it a while ago. So everything we do at Xanox is Python 3 whenever we're using Python. And again, I would echo what Ian said. Any new stuff, it makes sense to do in Python 3.
Well, just an additional question. How many of you are using PyPy in production or research, but using PyPy on a daily basis? Anyone? Oh. Jason? Jason? 1 IronPython? Okay, so it's all pretty much CPython. Okay. All right, we're in the last 5 minutes, so I've got... Oh, was there a question? Sorry, Thomas, you've been standing there forever.
I thought I was supposed to ask one. So I was just wondering what your views are on the difference in data science industry between the States and Europe on sort of both sides. One is just the providers, so startups that are developing data science products, but also the customers in terms of companies that want to have data scientists and use it. And assuming, what my impression is that it's much smaller, where's the gap the biggest and what can we do sort of to close those?
So it's differences between US and Europe, yes, is the question in data science. And what are the differences? How can we close the gap? Yeah?
Yes.
So I think the biggest difference, and this is one of the things I was going to mention, is that it's simply time. So I think this is perhaps something we've also seen historically, is that Europe is sort of a bit behind sort of the trends that are happening in the States, and I think it's just a matter of time until we catch up, and perhaps eventually we'll have an active PyData meetup here in Berlin as well, I'm not sure we can rival the number of members that Python NYC has, but I think it's just a matter of time for sort of things to arrive here, for people to sort of become aware of this. And I think that sort of this conference is the first step in the right direction.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a number of years, but I guess what I'd like to add is that you can't bunch Europe together, unfortunately. There's a big difference between countries in Europe. UK, which is the market that I know most about, I would say is ahead of the rest of Europe, probably by at least a year in time. Very active data science scene, loads of startups, loads of meetups going on, huge interest, and companies really getting properly started with this. I think my experience from Germany, not having worked here, but having lived here for 6 years, is that Germans are a lot more scared of privacy issues, for instance. Brits don't care. They've got CCTV anyway. I mean, they're used to being spied on all the time. Germans are completely opposite, as far as I know. They are very private people. And the whole NSA thing that you mentioned, big data here is equated with NSA and being spied on, so it's a negative thing, and that's why I think it might take longer to get a foothold here. Southern Europe is still struggling with financial recovery, so that might take even longer. So you can't really just say Europe as a whole, but there are differences here. But yeah, I think it's a matter of time as well, as you say.
I think it's worth noting on there that certainly I see in London that the data science scene with Python started to grow up about 3 years ago. 5 years ago, I tried to organize a meetup around data in London, and I had almost no response from any of the developers that I knew. And then a couple of years later, it just appeared on the radar. And I've been running my consultancy for 10 years, so I've watched this sort of drought turn and grow up. At the same time, we've had the Euro SciPy group, which has been running for, is Mike in the room? I think Mike's not in the room. I think it's 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old. So running in Paris and Brussels, Leipzig. Okay, so running around Europe and running this year in the UK. So we've had a scientific Python community. It's been small, it's been more academic focused, and it's growing up. Now in parallel, we have the PyData community, which is a bit more business focused. So we have 2 communities running alongside the growing of EuroPython and more regional Python user groups. PyCon SE just recently, PyCon Ireland in a couple of months' time. And so we're seeing the community growing up very quickly. So I think it is laggy behind the States, but at the same time, I think it is growing quickly and becoming really quite a rich and interesting place. Now, we're in the last, I'm going to call it in a minute or so, so I'm just going to ask, I'm curious about the skills that are missing in companies which hinder the greater adoption of Python and data science. So just a quick survey of hands. How many of the companies or institutions that you're in would pay to send people on a course for basic Python, just learning Python from the get-go? Okay, and how many will pay and have a demand for doing that? Okay, and how many would do that for numeric skills? So say a NumPy course to start to understand numeric Python. Certainly mine, yeah. And then what about things like machine learning? So scikit-learn and other machine learning tools. How many might build on top of that? Okay, a couple. Okay, so a pretty thin need. What other needs are there? Okay, pandas. Pandas for data manipulation, data engineering. I mean, maybe less, or maybe it's very well documented already. What other are there? So let's close off with this question. Are there any other skills that are missing in the community, that are missing in academia and in the industrial world, which could be provided if the community realised that there was a gap, either for professional training or for more events like this or more training at conferences? Are there any things that we need to be aware of in the community that we can begin to provide to help grow the local scenes? Anyone want to fire any ideas in? Just shout them out.
Yeah, I think one thing is like actually tools and guidance, community building actually, and how to motivate people and get the message out there. Because in Germany, I think, for example, southern Germany, we have there are a lot of huge companies, but there are also like a lot of agencies, and they're all like family size. And as my perspective, there's like maybe like 10 20 people working there, and they solve anything like within family. So they don't go that much. So I think...
Is there demand for community-driven events?
I hope so. I just started a MongoDB meetup, so
okay.
I'm hoping.
Okay, so you started the MongoDB meetup. Valentin is co-organizing with Bagmeet, I think, the PyData Berlin meetup. We've seen rapid growth in the PyData London meetup. We're 10 weeks old and we're 370 members and more members growing. We're barely promoting it at the moment just because we're already over capacity. There was another hand that went up with an idea.
Cluster computing for scientists. So I'm a research scientist. I'm not in Berlin. I'm a research scientist at the Drug Research Center in France. But it also holds true when I was in academia in France. Very often small teams have commodity clusters, things we call vehicle clusters and stuff like that. So can be like a couple of vector machines and like 100. We have 60 machines. Right now in the Python space, I'm using PyData Berlin, but pretty much because I'm the only one who knows how to use the clusters, so it wouldn't scale to many, like let's say there are 10 people in the team using it jointly because you can recreate your deploy your Python servers, etc. So and the Python space cluster computing, I think is from my point of view a common use case for research organizations, either in academia or teams who have money.
Okay, so improvements in the cluster compute space, both. Okay. By my high-performance Python book, we discussed some cluster computing in there, including large-scale systems as deployed by Bitly, but it's not a research environment. Sure, sure. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Have you checked out Disco? And have you checked out Olivier Cauzel's talks that he does about Star Cluster on Amazon? Ah. Okay, so you need your own hardware.
Yeah, exactly. And in academia, it's the same thing. It's what you have a cluster, and you're only going to standard engine on top of it. And you want to set that from Python, you have two ways. Subprocess calls where you keep up your own stuff, or the same thing but with Python parallel. You set that dependencies. So still part of the same thing.
Okay, so more tooling and help around cluster compute.
PySpark? Sorry, Valentin wanted to know about PySpark.
So I recently learned that Continuum's Blaze has a backend for PySpark and for Spark, which is sort of this in-memory thing built around Hadoop.
In our use case, very often Hadoop is much slower than on a biggest machine with 32 cores or something like that. And I did machine learning and computer.
Are you guys using like MPI and stuff like that on your cluster? How do you use it right now? Okay, because that's also not fun.
Hang on. Let's carry this on in the pub afterwards. So I've got a question, then James has got a question. If in Germany there were more PyData Berlin, whatever, meetups, how many of you would attend? Okay, so there's a healthy demand there for some meetups. That's good to see. And over to James.
So I want to ask one last question of everyone in the audience. And I'm going to give you 3 choices and be careful how you respond. The first question is, who here in the audience is tired of Python? They're just like, okay, whatever. Okay, who here in the audience feels Python is their go-to tool? It's nothing special, it's okay, it gets the job done. It's something that I reach for when I need to solve a problem. And who here in the audience is excited about Python, enthusiastic? Up until 3 a.m. every night, you've been doing it for 10 years and you're still learning things new. You can't even sleep sometimes. You come to a conference like this and you learn 10 things and it's just blowing your mind for the last 10 years. You can't even put it into words. Woohoo! I want to see every hand up because I think that's the kind of community we want to build here. And you on the panel too.
Come on, panelists. All right, we're going to go off to the pub now. Valentin, which pub are we going to?
So we can go to any pub you like, but the Hofbräuhaus was suggested. So actually, there's a curious thing about Berliners. They only really know the area of Berlin that they actually live in, their own Kiez. So I don't actually know where the Hofbräuhaus is. but supposedly it's quite close to here.
We will all walk out there en masse in the next few minutes and head there. It's got a great big football slogan across the entire building opposite. So if you walk... football person. Giant great football thing, and opposite is a pub that seats 1,000 people, and they wear lederhosen, so you can't really miss it. We'll be there in a few minutes' time. All right, thank you very much.